The widow rode without a name. She'd shed it like a snake's skin at the edge of the Jornada del Muerto, where the light broke harsh and white across the earth, and the wind had no mercy. Her braids were cut ragged to the chin. Her horse bore the marks of hunger, and so did she. Days before, her moccasins had given out, and her soles were hard as horn now, crusted in blood and sand. A wrapped rifle rode across her back. A butcher's knife, too long for cooking, bounced at her hip. She carried nothing sentimental, not even the wampum her mother gave her, not the silver token from her husband's war belt. She had buried both names in the same grave. At first, there had been 6 men on her trail. They were wide-eyed and hungry for killing. She had watched them ride into her life with cruel casualness, not even dismounting to murder. They shot her husband through the mouth while he carved strips of smoked deer from the drying rack. They raped her sister, slit her boy's belly just to hear the sound, laughing. One of them wore a military coat. Another, a priest's collar stained with meat grease. What tribe they came from, if any, she didn't know. She only knew they came from the north, through Lincoln County, with bounty warrants and God on their lips. She had survived by falling still. The woman who had been Ashka, wife of Pino, mother of little Crane, had not screamed. Not when they burned the hogan, not when her sister was dragged screaming into the mesquite, not when she felt the old man spit on her neck. She had gone inward to the place the old ones spoke of, a cave behind the ribs where a soul waits, weaponless but watching. And when the last boot rode away, leaving blood-blackened footprints in the cracked soil, she crawled from under the woven reed mat. The screams had stopped. The fire was cold. Her child was a ruin. She didn't cry. She buried what was left and picked up the knife. Now she moved like a figure painted onto the sky, the sun behind her back, the silence of the desert parting before her like bone dust. On the 5th night, a storm rose sudden and mean. Not rain, never rain, but a wind that tore grit off the cliffs and flung it sideways. She found shelter in an old mining shaft, long abandoned, its timber bones creaking like a dying animal. There, under the rotting remains of a shaft lift, she made a fireless camp and chewed dried mesquite pods until her jaw ached. She slept with the knife in her hand. She didn't expect dreams, but they came. In one, her husband stood in the flames, whispering. In another, she was a child again, watching her father die from a cavalry bullet near Guadalupe Pass, his horse collapsing in the arroyo beside him. But the third dream was different. In it, a rider came across the desert, dressed in rags. His face was ash pale, and though he never spoke, she knew what he meant. They will follow, and so will I. When she woke, she felt watched. It wasn't the kind of watching men did. It was something colder. Animal, but more. The shaft was dark. Her horse, tethered outside, pawed once but didn't panic. She rose, stepped barefoot into the dust. The wind had stilled. And on the far hill, where the moon carved silver from the land, a figure sat on a dun-colored Mustang, still as a tombstone, wrapped in what might have been a Confederate duster or a burial shroud. No sound, no movement. Then he turned the horse and vanished into the Badlands. She didn't speak, she didn't need to. She had grown up with stories of the Chindii, the ghost riders of the lost, spirits that came not for comfort but for vengeance. That morning, she rode with new hunger in her gut. By then, one of the 6 men was already dead. She hadn't killed him. He'd been found near a dry well, throat torn out, blood sprayed high onto the rocks behind. The rumors said it was a cougar, but the wound was too clean, too cold. The other 5 didn't linger to ask questions. They pushed south, driven by gold and rage. One of them, Seth Morrow, the one with the burn scar across his chin, spat in the dirt when they passed the kill site. Said he'd seen something move in the dusk. Said it felt wrong, like being watched from the bottom of a grave. The others laughed at him. But not for long. The widow crossed the salt flats in a night. No human did that. The place was death to horses and worse to women alone, but she made it somehow. On the other side, she found a sheep herder's shack and took what she needed. Blankets, tin of jerky, a length of rope. She left a Mescalero prayer marked on the wall, something old, something the land remembered even if men had forgotten. Days turned, the tracks grew sharper. She came on them by accident, then by design. A patch of blood where one of the men had cut his hand, a discarded whiskey bottle, a smudge of gun oil in the grit. She followed like a coyote on a scent, quiet, starving, eyes bright with a purpose so deep it no longer needed words. On the 10th day, she found the second body. This one hung from a twisted cottonwood, his eyes eaten by crows. No footprints led away. Just the mark of horse hooves burned into the ground, deep, unnatural, as if made by weight not of this world. She felt no joy, only heat in her chest. Still, she whispered thanks. From that day forward, she wasn't alone. The ghost did not speak, did not ride beside her in the full sense, but he appeared on ridgelines, in cloud reflections on waterholes, once in the flicker of flame when she kindled dry juniper under a bluff. His presence was unmistakable. He bore the look of someone who had died too many times to care about the line between earth and ash. Sometimes she swore she saw the slits of old rope around his neck, or the jagged line of a bullet tear through his chest, but his eyes never wavered. He was hers now, or she was his. The hunters did not know it yet, but they were being hunted too. The widow rode south, toward the bone rock spires of Huco tanks where ancient hands once painted spirits on the cave walls. The place of old reckonings, of blood offerings. The wind picked up there. She leaned into it, feeling the weight of every mile behind her. At her back death followed, but it no longer wore her face. It wore his. And he was just getting started. They woke to frost, crusting the saddle leather. Even in the desert, the cold could slip in like a thief, sharp and mean. She didn't shiver. Her blood had gone beyond warmth. The horse grunted beneath her as she adjusted the pack, shifting weight off its strained haunches. She spoke to it once low in Mescalero tongue, a sound more breath than word. The creature flicked its ears. Loyal not from affection, but from the same will that drove her, survival. 2 nights past, she had come on the fresh coals of a campfire, still warm. Not hers, too big, too careless. They were close now, the last 4. One had a broken stirrup. She'd found the twisted leather tossed down a ravine. Another left behind a cartridge box with a missing latch. She catalogued these things like a ledger of their failings. Time was shaving them down. She would do the rest. At Huco tanks, she did not stop to pray. She moved among the boulders like someone returning to a home long forsaken. There were spirits here, but she did not ask for their help. Some powers respected silence more than speech. She passed under the painted caves and saw the old ochre hands reaching down from the walls, pale ghosts of another people's grief. A child had once died here, thrown from the cliff's edge. They said her laughter still echoed in the rocks at dusk, but the widow heard no laughter now. Only the scrape of boots, the scent of sweat, the careless ring of a spurred heel against stone. She followed. By dusk she had eyes on them. The 4 rode hard, driving their horses beyond wisdom. They were gaunter now. One coughed blood into his glove. Another cursed God for the dream that wouldn't leave him, where something dragged him through the sand by his throat. She watched them argue over a canteen. One wanted to turn back. The others laughed until the man pulled his revolver and threatened the rest. She watched it all from behind a rock outcropping, her breath steady, hand resting on the rifle. She could kill one now, maybe 2, but she didn't raise the barrel. Not yet. The wind changed. And then the horses screamed. They reared with no cause. One flung its rider into the rocks. Another bolted, eyes rolled white, gone in a burst of dust and panic. The men shouted, drew guns, fired into nothing. The sound cracked against the cliffs. She saw him then. The rider. Closer now, not an apparition this time, but a shape of shadow on horseback, as solid as earth but wrong in a way that defied explanation. He moved without sound, the Mustang beneath him leaving no tracks. His coat fluttered though the air was still. One of the men fired straight at him. The bullet hit something but not flesh. A metallic clang like it struck armor buried under grave dirt. The rider did not flinch, he only looked, and the man dropped the pistol, hands shaking. Then the widow moved. She stepped into the open, rifle raised. The man on the ground, the one who'd wanted to turn back, saw her first. His mouth opened, but no words came. She shot him through the eye. He fell forward, blood pooling beneath his cheek. The others scattered, but she didn't chase. She stood her ground, rifle barrel smoking. The ghost rider turned his gaze toward her, then back toward the horizon. And vanished. By morning, the last 3 had split. Cowards always ran. She tracked one into the wash, a lean man with wild yellow hair and a nervous twitch at the corner of his mouth. She found him tangled in the roots of a dry mesquite, trying to hide behind dead branches. His eyes went wide when he saw her, no rifle in hand, just a knife trembling. "I ain't the one who did it," he said. She said nothing. "I didn't touch the boy, that was Caleb, swear it." Still, she said nothing. He raised the knife. She shot his leg. He dropped with a howl, hands scrabbling at the sand. She walked to him, took the knife from his fingers, and drove it into his throat before he could beg. Two remained. The widow buried the rifle after that. It had done its work. What came next would be close, personal. She cleaned her blade and smeared a line of ash beneath each eye. Not paint, not war, just remembrance. She spoke her son's name into the wind, then her sister. Her husband's name she kept inside. The next man was found dead before she reached him. No blood, just cold, skin blue in the moonlight. His chest opened like a broken birdcage, no signs of struggle. His lips frozen in the shape of a scream. The ground around him was swept clean. No footprints. Only hoof marks, deep, burned into stone. The widow crouched beside the corpse. His eyes stared upward, unfocused. She closed them with 2 fingers, not out of mercy, but to mark the death, to claim it. The desert gave her no answers, only silence. She turned toward the last one, Caleb Dunn. He had been the worst of them. The leader, the man who called her sister a squaw, who laughed when the hogan burned, who poured molasses into her son's mouth before the blade. She remembered his face in pieces. The beard, the crooked nose, the way his eyes squinted when he smiled, the kind of man who'd gut a deer and whistle while he did it. Now he ran. He'd stolen another horse, northbound, toward the Picos, toward the white towns where he could disappear behind badges and lies, but the widow knew the land better. She took the old Kiowa trail, a path so narrow it vanished into cliff edges, where the rocks rose sharp and high like the ribs of buried giants. She didn't sleep. She didn't eat. Only drank from the same stream her father had bled into 30 years before. The rider followed too, sometimes behind, sometimes ahead, never speaking, never needing to. At dawn, she came to the canyon pass. Below, Caleb rode hard through the red stone mouth of the desert, unaware. His hat blown off, one arm bandaged, the other clutched a revolver like prayer beads. She watched from above, wind tangling what was left of her hair. She waited until he passed beneath her, then dropped the old Spanish rock, heavier than it looked. It smashed his horse's skull. The beast went down with a crunch. Caleb rolled free, screaming. She climbed down. Slow, intentional, knife in hand. He saw her coming and scrambled back, face twisted with disbelief. You, he rasped, you're dead. She said nothing. He raised the revolver, fired. The shot went wide, panic shaking his aim. He tried again. The hammer clicked on an empty chamber. She stood over him now. He looked up, shaking. You ain't even human, he said. She knelt, placed a hand on his throat. No, she said, I buried what was human with my boy. And then she cut him open. Not fast, not gentle. When it was done, she sat beside the body until the wind cooled the blood. The ghost rider stood at the canyon mouth, watching, waiting. She didn't thank him. Didn't need to. Some vengeance is its own offering. She rose, took nothing from the body, burned it instead, fed the flame with the man's coat, his hat, his bullets, left the ashes for the coyotes. That night the wind turned warm. The ghost rode once more into the dark, slower now, fading, and when she rose the next morning he was gone. The widow stood alone again. But something in her had changed. She didn't ride home. There was no home, only the skeleton of a life burned down to embers. The hogan had long since turned to cinders, and the grave she dug lay unmarked beneath scorched stone, watched only by hawks and dry wind. Still, she went back through the lands that once knew her name. She passed the place where her son had fallen, a space too quiet even for insects. She passed the charred mesquite her sister had clung to when the blood ran down her thighs. She stepped into the outline of her husband's body, where the earth still bore the dent his corpse had made, and stood there until her shadow fit the shape. The air held her breath like smoke. No one stopped her. The white ranchers had moved east that spring, driven off by dry wells and whispers of killings out past the flats. The bounty hunters turned their sights north, chasing Comanche scalps and easy money. What soldiers remained were little more than drunkards with dull spurs and bad knees. The land had emptied of men with purpose. Only vultures remained, and the old ones who knew better than to speak the names of spirits aloud. The widow became one of them. She drifted from camp to camp, never sleeping twice in the same place. She rode with no fire, ate little, drank less. Time thickened and slowed around her, days dripping past like sap off dead wood. Some said she was mad. Others that she'd made a pact with devils who lived beneath the sand. Children whispered stories about the ghost woman who rode with bones tied to her horse's tail and knives in her boots. The old men, though, they remembered her father. They remembered the blood price of the cavalry raids, and the way she looked like someone who had paid that price in full. She spoke only when needed. When a trader asked her name, she gave none. He offered sugar and calico. She took only salt and bullets. Later, he found a turquoise bead on his wagon tongue, Mescalero work, fine and old. He nailed it over his door and never saw her again. Seasons changed, storms came and went. The ghost rider did not return. But signs remained. A pale horse, untethered, seen by moonlight on a canyon rim. A sound like hooves over gravel where there was no road. A bell that rang once in a church that hadn't stood for a decade, always near her, always watching. She didn't call him, but he was not gone. There was a time she thought it had ended, that the blood was buried deep enough. But one spring morning she woke to the smell of horses, not her own, 6 of them tied to cottonwood trunks, saddle leather worn but oiled, traces of blue cloth beneath their blankets. The men wore pistols and new hats. U.S. Marshals, or said they were. The widow stood on the high rock ledge above them, hair braided tight again, rifle slung low across her spine. She listened, watched. Their leader was named Captain Luther Chaffee, a man who spoke like he was born giving orders. He told the others they were hunting a killer, said a woman had butchered 5 citizens of the United States, said there was a bounty now, real paper from Washington, with a seal and everything. One of the others laughed and said he'd shoot her below the waist, make it fun. Another spat and called her red vermin. The widow watched, marked them. Noticed the way Chaffee's right boot dragged slightly, an old cavalry wound. Noticed the scar on the left ear of the man who chewed tobacco and carried a Spencer carbine. She noted which one tied his reins too tight, which one had a cough he kept trying to hide. She waited until they left, then she followed. It took her 2 days to reach their camp. She found them near Dead Man's Gulch, a circle of bedrolls beneath cotton clouds. They drank from their canteens, told stories about New Orleans girls, argued about whether she'd be taken alive or not. That night, one of them never woke up. He was the youngest, clean-faced, maybe too clean. His neck had been broken so cleanly it didn't bruise. The others found him cold at dawn, eyes open to the stars. No tracks, no struggle, just gone. They didn't speak the word ghost, but they lit no fire that night. On the second day, another man went missing. They heard the scream, high, short, then nothing. They found his boots 15 yards from his horse. The horse had been sliced from throat to hind, guts laid out like offerings. Again, no sign, no blood trail leading away. The marshals began to mutter prayers. Captain Chaffee kept his men close after that, rode tight, rifles out, told them the desert was playing tricks, that men got soft in the heat, that they were professionals, but the widow knew his kind. She could see it in his face when dusk fell and the shadows stretched too long. He was remembering stories he'd heard when he was a boy, the ones that came before guns and badges. She wanted them afraid. Then she wanted them dead. The third man, Eli Crane, the one with the Spencer, died at the widow's hand. He'd wandered off to piss near a boulder field. She was waiting behind it, slipped the knife in below the ribs, under the lungs, twisted just once. He didn't scream, only gasped. She let him fall gently, eyes wide with disbelief. She left his gun where it fell. They found him just before sunrise. Chaffee spat and swore they were being hunted, said it wasn't just her now. Something else was riding with her, something worse than a woman. He was right. By then the others wanted to turn back. He wouldn't let them, promised double bounty, promised she was just flesh. But he didn't believe it, not anymore. The widow made sure he had no sleep for 3 nights. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the ghost rider standing at the edge of the firelight. Once the thing spoke, not aloud, but in the deep hollow of his thoughts where old sins had long taken root. You will ride until your blood feeds the earth. On the 5th day, the widow led them to Black Crow Narrows, a place known only to her people, a place where sound vanished and the sky felt too close. She rode into the canyon slow, letting hoofprints press deep in the red dust. The marshals followed, wary but trapped by pride. They didn't notice the heat change, didn't smell the old rot in the stones. At the end of the pass, she stopped, waited. When they came into view, she stepped out, alone. Chaffee drew first, fired once. She vanished behind stone. Then the ghost rider rode in. He did not charge, he moved like mist. His horse made no sound. The wind went dead. The marshals raised rifles, but it was like aiming at smoke. The first shot went nowhere. The second tore into their own man's chest. Panic broke them. One tried to flee. A jagged rock tore his face off as his horse went wild. Another knelt, praying in some backwoods dialect, but his mouth filled with blood as something unseen crushed his ribs inward. The last man fired until the hammer clicked dry, then tried to eat the bullets instead of face what was coming. Captain Chaffee stood alone. The widow stepped out. He saw her clearly now, the war paint dry and cracked, the knife in one hand, her dead boy's memory hanging from a scrap of cloth tied around her wrist. He reached for his pistol, but his hand was trembling. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I already did," she answered. She didn't rush him, just walked forward. He raised his gun. The ghost stepped between them. Chaffee's pistol shattered in his hand. Then he screamed. It was not the scream of a man dying. It was the scream of a soul dragged back into every wound it ever made. The desert held its breath. When the echo faded, the canyon was empty. The widow stood alone, blood drying on her cheek. The ghost was gone again. But not for long. The rains came late that year. Lightning broke the sky like old glass and scorched the plain with fire that didn't burn. The widow watched from the mouth of a cavern, high in the Oregon mountains. Water poured from the stone ledges and soaked the packed dust of the canyon floor, turning the bones there to paste. She didn't move. Rain was rain, rare and cruel and always taking more than it gave, but it washed the blood from her knife, and that was something. The mountains were sacred to her people. Her mother had brought her here once, to fast in the high rocks and listen for the old songs. Back then, she believed the gods lived in wind and animal and smoke. Now she knew they lived in silence, in the hard stillness between a scream and a knife, in the weight of a stare that never left you. She had become a god in her own right. The killings hadn't stopped. Word spread through trading posts and cavalry camps of a woman riding alone, Mescalero, they guessed, or maybe half Apache, maybe worse. A killer, a butcher. Some said she wore a necklace of ears. Others claimed she had no tongue and could not speak the names of the dead for fear they would come back. They weren't far wrong. The widow was hunting again, not for the men who had wronged her. That work was done. She had cut their names from the earth. What remained now were the ones who profited from the ruin. The traders who sold her people's land in backroom deals. The priests who baptized children only to send them to rail camps. The ranchers who built fences across sacred hunting trails and strung up boys for stealing cattle they once owned by birthright. The war had never ended. It had just changed uniforms. She didn't call it revenge anymore. It was simpler than that, arithmetic. For every one taken, one would be taken in return. She began with a banker in Mesilla, a soft man with soft hands who once smiled as he evicted 7 Mescalero families from the riverbed, claiming the land was under federal claim. She slit his throat while he pissed in a chamber pot behind his house, walked out through the front door in daylight, cloak heavy with blood, and no one stopped her. Next, a missionary in Socorro, white hair, pale eyes, liked to take girls from the orphanage on walks into the cottonwoods. She left him staked to a tree with his holy book nailed through his chest. The nuns found him at sunrise and screamed so loud it scattered the buzzards. Each time she left a mark. Not a name, not a sign. Just a single dark feather bound with sinew and hair. Mescalero mourning work. Those who knew understood. The ghost did not ride with her now, not often, only when the killing was near. He was quieter, harder to see. His presence came in the shiver of horses, the way a match refused to light, the frost that formed on windows even in heat. He had done what he came to do. Now he lingered like a final breath. She did not miss him. But when he came, her hands steadied. She headed north. The U.S. government had opened a new reservation along the Rio Grande. Fort Stanton had grown fat off stolen land and rail contracts. And behind the walls, men lived in soft uniforms, drawing maps of territory they'd never walked, calling her people hostiles. The widow didn't hate them. Hate was too human. She regarded them like a wound regards the knife. She came in through the arroyos. Fort Stanton was a garrison town of white stone and fences. Cattle lowed behind timber stockades. Soldiers played cards on porches. Civilians drank from iron cups and laughed at nothing. At night, the moon struck off the brass buttons of men too drunk to stand guard. She studied them for a week, slept in the dry caves outside the river gorge, knew their names, their routines, chose one. Colonel Ezra Harrow, Kentucky-born, cavalry star, claimed to be a friend to the tribes and shook hands with chiefs before sending their sons to die in copper mines. Had a son of his own, dead from fever, had a hatred deeper than patriotism. He lived in a white house behind the barracks. The widow came for him in winter. She climbed through the chimney, waited in the flue until the fire died to ash. Her skin blistered, her hands went raw, but she did not make a sound. When he stepped into the parlor with a bottle of rye in one hand, she dropped behind him like smoke and crushed his windpipe with her knee. Took 6 minutes. She counted each one. When he was gone, she carved a line across his chest. Not his name, her son's. She left the house clean, silent. The soldiers never found how she entered, never knew why the maps on his walls had been slashed to ribbons or why the dog refused to go near the parlor after that. Panic bloomed in the territory. New posters, bigger bounties, rangers called down from Kansas. Texas mercenaries hired in droves. They didn't understand what they were facing. They still thought she was flesh and blood alone, a madwoman, a rogue. They didn't know she had gone beyond that. One by one, they came for her. Gunmen, bounty chasers, ex-scouts who'd once spoken Apache and thought it made them wise. One tried to trap her in a ravine with bare bait and whiskey. She gutted him and left him dangling from his own stirrup straps. Another used dogs. She cut their throats while they slept beside him. They kept coming. She kept killing. Not all quick, not all clean. But all remembered. One summer day she walked into the center of Chilarosa in broad daylight, wore a gray dress. Her hair braided with thorns, carried no weapon. Sat at the edge of the well and waited. People watched from behind curtains. No one approached. At noon, a man stepped into the square. Deputy Thomas Wills, big, red-faced, nervous fingers. He'd beaten 3 boys nearly to death last year for stealing corn. The youngest had died in jail. Wills never lost sleep over it. Now he stepped toward the widow like he owned the earth beneath him. "You got a death wish," he said. She looked at him and smiled. He hesitated. Maybe he saw something move behind her. Maybe he just felt it, something old, something wrong, but it was too late. His pistol was already drawn. He didn't see the rider until it was behind him. The Mustang crushed him into the dirt. Not fast, just enough to break every bone in his back. He screamed once, then went still. The ghost paused beside the widow. She stood, touched the horse's neck. Then they left. Not fast, not afraid. From that day forward, they called her La Sombra del Desierto, the desert's shadow. No longer hunted. No longer alone. She rode until the land forgot her. Past the basin where rivers once ran, through salt-blind flats that cracked beneath the hooves of her horse. Into country where no map dared reach. The old ones called it Endenda, the hollowed ground, said even ghosts lost their way out there. The widow did not turn back. She wasn't fleeing. She was finishing. Word of her had stretched farther than she ever meant. Beyond the Rio, past the border towns, over the mountains where the Yaqui whispered her name like a wind-borne curse. Even in New Mexico territory, the soldiers spoke her deeds with the unease reserved for prophecy. Some said she'd cursed the soil itself. that where her shadow passed, no grass would grow, that cattle miscarried when she stared too long. The death count had long ceased to matter. She wasn't counting, but someone else was. He rode into Carrizozo 2 weeks behind her, asking quiet questions, showing a piece of leather embossed with a federal seal. Said his name was Ryland Kate, wore no uniform, carried papers signed by a judge in Santa Fe, and a revolver with 6 notches cut into the grip. The townsfolk saw the way he moved, efficient, quiet, the kind of man who'd buried too many to waste breath talking about it. He didn't drink, didn't laugh. He just listened. When they asked what she'd done to earn the contract, he said only, she kept going. He tracked her through ash and silence, from the wells where the water turned bitter after she passed, through valleys where the birds stopped singing. He found a man with no eyes wandering half dead out of a cave, mumbling her name and the phrase she doesn't sleep. He found a burned chapel with a single feather nailed to the altar and a rifle barrel bent backward like it had melted. Ryland Kate didn't flinch. He'd killed worse, so he believed. It was high in the Guadalupe escarpment that he found the last trace. A fire pit, cold, stones laid carefully, not like a woman's hands, but a warrior's tight, calculated, ritualistic. Nearby, a horse's hoofprint, deep and scorched at the edges. Not natural. He touched it with 2 fingers, came away with soot. That night, he dreamed of a voice with no mouth. He dreamed of blood falling like snow. When he woke, his horse was gone. He didn't curse, didn't panic, just picked up his satchel, adjusted his belt, and walked. It took him 3 days to find her. She waited at the edge of the Sierra Blanca, where the cliffs dropped off into an endless sea of ochre stone and juniper shadow. She wore a shawl now, tattered and bleached pale by the sun. Her hair was mostly white, her hands rough as bark, but she stood tall, knife at her hip, eyes like flint. Ryland Kate approached without drawing. "Been a long trail," he said. She didn't speak. He looked past her, into the dust where no path led. "You know what they call you." Her gaze didn't shift. "They call you a shadow, say you died and came back meaner." She said nothing. Ryland's hand rested on his revolver. "I don't believe in ghosts." The widow tilted her head, like a hawk studying a dying rabbit. Then she spoke. "You will." He drew. She was faster. Not by speed of hand, but by something older, something time couldn't dull. She stepped through the draw like water through reeds, and the knife she carried found the hollow under his arm, slipped between ribs, bit the lung. He gasped, fired once, missed. She twisted the blade. He dropped. Didn't beg, didn't curse. Just looked at her with eyes already glazing, like he'd seen the shape of his own death and recognized it too late. She knelt beside him, pulled the paper from his coat. "Read the warrant." It listed none of the names she had avenged, not her husband, not her son, not the priest or the colonel or the butchered boys, just the charge of murder in the 1st degree, issued by men who'd never tasted loss, never knelt in ash. She burned it. The wind took the ashes. That night the ghost came one last time. Not on horseback, not as a shape, but as breath in the leaves, as stillness where no stillness should be. She sat by her fire, watching its light crackle against the canyon walls. She knew what he'd come for. She had nothing left to kill. Nothing left to bury. So she spoke for the first time in moons. "I am finished." The fire flared once, then dropped low. Behind her, the sound of hooves. Slow, heavy. But when she turned, there was no one. The morning came quiet. She packed no weapons, left the knife in the dirt, mounted her horse and rode east toward no place in particular. Some say she died out there, swallowed by the desert that bore her. Others claim she became a ghost herself, riding beside the wind, seen only when vengeance walks. But there were stories, years later, of a woman in a border town who stitched wounds for dying men and spoke to no one, who carried no name, who vanished when the rains came. And always beside her door, a feather, black as night, tied with sinew, waiting.